Welcome to episode 10 of Gone Mental, where we are discussing, or mainly Kristy will be discussing retraumatisation by having to retell your story to multiple authority figures and people. Kristy?
My first experience I want to talk about is I chose no longer to use the local mental health outpatient unit because due to a lack of psychiatrists, I was put on interns. I was only allowed to see them once every 3 months.
Can you better explain what you mean by being put on interns?
Interns are doctors training to be psychiatrists. Yeah. And some of them were very good, but I only got to see them once because I was only seeing doctors every 3 months. So every 3 months I would see a new one. I stopped bothering to learn their names because I knew I'd never see them again.
Right. So a different newly trained or training doctor every 3 months to describe what you were going through, your current progress, your history, all of that.
Yeah, and most of those meetings would only last 15 minutes, and if that, and I would be upset by that. So I know this is a problem that other local patients have also had. I use the word patient because when you're dealing with the health system, you are a patient. Yes. Okay, rather than a consumer who has choices. You don't have any choices. Many of the doctors I saw were very good, but it was the fact that I could only see them once.
You had no continuity.
Yeah. Continuity of care I think is key, and that's why I want to use my GP from now on.
But didn't they have access to the same notes, or did they not share them?
I think they did have access to the same notes. My file was huge. They didn't have time, I believe, to read it because I think if I'd said that I wasn't travelling well, they might go back and have a look more at the notes. If they wanted to admit me into a hospital, I would have been seen by another doctor who would have, with them, gone through my notes. That's speculation, but I think that's pretty close. But because they have to see so many people and they wouldn't be using interns to the point that they are now if it wasn't for the fact that they don't have enough psychiatrists.
And that you're being seen in outpatients, which is emergency, which by definition is generally quite overloaded.
Yeah. And this is like where we live has one of the lowest budgets and one of the highest numbers of consumers. So it's not actually the doctors themselves who are at fault necessarily, but somebody's got to do something to change that.
So it's under-resourcing of the system.
Yeah.
Fewer psychiatrists, less money, too many patients.
Yeah. Okay. And because of that, and because I'm lucky that I have a wonderful GP, in another episode we'll be talking about finding an informed GP.
That can make all the difference.
The importance of your GP. I've chosen to manage my mental health with my GP for the time being. And
you're also university educated. You've done quite a bit of self-education with psychology, so as well.
I'm informed
you know the field fairly well. Yeah.
I'm informed enough to make good choices for myself. I think that there are other consumers who just don't have the information or the opportunity or the knowledge.
Or they have an episode, they go manic, they land in an emergency, they're completely unprepared.
Yeah, and then they start using the mental health system often for the rest of their lives. There's consumers that, or in this case patients, that don't know that they can say no. They don't know that they don't have to continue to see these psychiatrists. And another issue being, if you want to use some medication, if that medication is helpful for you, you can only do it through the hospital program. My mum does that. She's been on the same medication for nearly 20 years and she has to have a blood test once a month, and the only way to do that is through our local hospital. Not because she can't get a blood test from the GP, but that hospital is the only one in the area that can administer the medication because it's a controlled substance.
Right. So that's like a structural restriction.
Which means people can't choose to leave because they can't get that medication off their private. And also, finances is another reason people might be stuck in the mental health system if they're still seeing interns and that, because they can't afford the cost of a private psychiatrist.
Yeah, if you can afford private psychiatry, private psychiatric hospitals, I think Kristy will be talking about this in another episode. Some private psychiatric hospitals are no better or worse, but many are quite good. Some of them are even great. So it's the old rule that if you have money, you can generally get better care.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what we're talking about, this is social justice for people at the poorer end of the scale, or people who have moderate income, as opposed to people who have a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Another issue I want to touch on, Andrew, is Centrelink. Mm-hmm. And now there's been some changes to the legislation in Centrelink where you have to see an independent doctor. Centrelink provides, as well as an assessor that Centrelink provides.
This is for what, to qualify for disability support pension, for instance?
Yes. It is purely to qualify for the disability support pension, as opposed to New Start, where you don't have to admit that you have a mental illness. And we'll talk more about these payments and the system in Australia in another episode. But thanks for clarifying
several
that,
episodes.
Yes, it will be.
Yes, because that's quite complicated.
But when I went for the pension, I was seen by a psychologist. Now, not all psychologists have good training in mental health.
I remember when I did my psychology major 30 years ago, and reflecting on that now after I had my diagnosis 10 years ago, it occurred to me, I don't think I learned anything about mental illness at university. And I've spoken to a number of people who are currently studying psych, even at postgrad level, and they say that hasn't changed. Psychologists really are not taught very much in the institutions about mental illness. They tend to, I think, pick it up in their real world experience, and I think that's a real shame.
The first psychologist who assessed me for the pension denied me the pension because I was too sick and too unstable. I can't believe that she had any understanding of what bipolar is.
Or even what episodic mental illness was. Really.
Yes. And so she said, because you might get better in 2 years, well, actually this is a lifelong illness that has episodes within it. She said I had to stay on New Start and then go back to a disability employment services. These are another things that we're going to discuss in
Kristy's definitely going to talk more about disability employment services and job network.
And anyway, I rang up and I appealed that decision. That decision, I got a man on the phone who had no qualifications in mental health. I asked for somebody with a qualification in mental health. I was told they had none, for assessing an appeal for disability support pension based on the grounds of mental health. I couldn't see anyone with any training in mental health. And then he asked me why I would ever have children. That was painful. And I had to tell my story a little bit to him. And then after I refused to deal with him any longer, once that question came up, I had to wait till the next day to get called again to do the same interview with somebody still not qualified over the phone, where they denied my appeal. 18 months later, I was still in a position where I had not found employment. I had a minor episode of depression, and I appealed for the pension again. This time I got a psychologist from Centrelink who actually said to me, I have somebody I love who has a bipolar. I really believe she understood me and she cared about me because she'd had lived experience of caring for somebody with bipolar. She didn't tell me she was a psychologist, because one of the things I said to her was, I hate psychologists.
So this is the importance of finding a person who is not only, for instance, a psychologist, but they have the real world experience to say, yes, I know what you're talking about. I'm going to do maybe a podcast by myself about my ambition to become a clinical psychologist who specialises in mental illness.
I would love you to do that, Andrew.
So looking forward to that if I could possibly afford it. That's a subject for another day.
So now Centrelink means you have to have another independent doctor, and it's very hard to open up to all these strangers about all the issues surrounding your mental health.
Especially if they're not qualified and they don't know what the hell you're talking about.
And not all GPs understand mental health, and you've got to find one that treats you first as a person and that you connect with as a person, and B, has some understanding of mental health. And so
preferably doesn't only have 6 minutes to see you before the next patient comes in.
And I really wonder about the qualifications of any doctor who wants to work for Centrelink, because they'd be earning so much less than if they worked for themselves or worked in other ways as a GP. So, but now you have to tell another person, open up. You might not have to do that with your GP, because I imagine that in some cases you've been seeing them for a number of years. And like when I asked my doctor to fill out my form for the pension, he didn't have to go through he went a little bit through my notes, he chatted with me a little bit, but mostly he knew me. He knew that he sees me a few times, probably 6 or so times a year, and he knows me quite well, and he was able to write down my symptoms and that without doing it in a way that would upset me or where I had to go into detail.
The thing is, the government seems to be trying to rationalise this by saying, oh, we want to do an audit, we want to bring in an independent doctor to recheck. But you don't think it's working, do you, Kristy?
No, I just think it's another way to do welfare bashing, which we'll talk about in another episode.
Another several episodes, probably.
But I think that it's about looking good, looking like they've cracked down on bludgers.
And everyone who has mental illness, we're all bludgers. You can absolutely depend on it.
The government sometimes makes me feel that that's what they think. Yeah. And it makes me wonder, don't you live in the real world? Don't you have friends, relatives and loved ones with a mental illness? Because 1 in 2 people have it now, so you must have a very small circle if you only know successful people who don't have any mental illnesses.
But lots of them are in denial. And we've got to do a podcast on that. How many more dozen ones have we flagged this stuff? I think we better tie it up there before we go on too long. Send us your feedback and let us know which podcast you want to hear next.
Have you been re-traumatised by having to tell your story multiple times? Yes. Share in the feedback. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye.